Out west, where the sun hangs lower and the wind carries the dust of forgotten names, there are stories that never made the newspapers, but linger in the hearts of those who've lived long enough to know that love doesn't always knock loudly. This is one of those stories. It begins not with fireworks, but with silence. Her name was Eleanor. 51 years old, calloused hands from decades of washing clothes that weren't hers, a heart stitched back together too many times to count, and a mouth that hadn't smiled for years. Not because she didn't want to, but because life hadn't given her much reason to. Widowed young then, forced to remarry, not out of love, but out of necessity. Used to being spoken at not spoken to. She learned to survive in silence. And that silence was mistaken over and over for coldness. So when she answered an ad to be a mail-order bride, sent her photograph her honest age, and even warned, "I don't smile much," the man replied once, then never again. And just like that, another door closed. But someone else saw that same ad. A man who'd lost his wife years earlier, not to death, but to bitterness. A man who had once chased loud laughter, only to realize that peace comes in quieter forms. He didn't need a woman who smiled all the time. He needed someone who stayed. So he wrote to Eleanor, but he didn't ask her to smile. He sent his own first, and waited. This is the story of what happened next, a story not about grand gestures, but small mercies. Not about youth or beauty, but about kindness that lingers. And if you've ever felt overlooked, or been told you were too serious, or watched the world reward the loud while forgetting the gentle, then maybe, just maybe, this story was meant for you. Because sometimes it's not the smile that wins someone's heart. It's the patience to wait for one that's real. Eleanor Boone hadn't smiled in years, not because she didn't know how, but because every time she had tried as a child, as a young woman, as a bride, someone had told her in so many cruel ways that her face wasn't built for joy, that her lips were too thin, that her eyes turned downward, that her smile looked like a frown trying to pretend. By the time she turned 52, she no longer tried, not even out of politeness. People mistook her silence for bitterness, her stillness for arrogance. But Eleanor was none of those things. She was just tired. And tired people don't smile easily. She had been a housekeeper, a nursemaid, a wife once, a widow longer. She'd buried a child and had no more after that. When her cousin handed her a copy of the Harper's Weekly, its lonely hearts for the West column circled in pencil, Eleanor didn't laugh. She didn't scoff. She simply looked at the ad-seeking bride for homestead life. Must be of sound mind, honest heart. Smile preferred. She paused at that last line, then folded the page, sat down and began writing. What possessed her to reply, she never knew. Perhaps it was the weariness. Perhaps it was the strange memory of her husband once saying, "You'd be lovely if you smiled more." Perhaps it was the fact that no one else had ever stayed long enough to wait for that smile to come on its own. So she wrote. Her letter was brief, honest, and without embellishment. She did not flatter. She did not beg. She merely said, "I can cook so and keep things warm. I have no illusions. I will not smile unless I mean it, but I will stay." Weeks passed. Then a letter arrived from a man named Samuel Merritt, a rancher outside of Deadwood, a widower, childless. He liked her honesty, he said, and if she was still willing, she could come by train to meet him. Her ticket was enclosed. Eleanor packed only one bag. She wore her Sunday dress, a navy wool that had never fit quite right, and she boarded that train with no promise but a hope tucked quietly beside her, the kind of hope that doesn't shine, but hums softly under the ribs. But when she arrived, there was no man waiting. No rancher in a brown hat holding a sign, no cart, no horses, just a child, no 7 of them. Dirty-faced, wide-eyed, huddled together like wind-blown leaves on a lonely platform. The eldest girl held out a piece of torn paper with shaky hands. On it was scrawled, "She's coming. Her name is Eleanor. Please don't let her leave." And just like that, Eleanor Boone, who hadn't smiled in 20 years, felt something tug deep in her chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something like a beginning. She came for a husband and found 7 children instead. No directions, no explanation. Only a snowstorm rolling in a house she had never seen waiting at the edge of nowhere. The wagon that carried Eleanor and the children rattled down the frozen dirt path, groaning with every rut. The snow had begun to fall soft and steady, covering the prairie like a white sheet drawn over something lost. None of the children spoke. Even the youngest, a curly-haired toddler who clung to Eleanor's shawl like a lifeline, was silent as if sound might break what little peace they had left. Eleanor didn't ask questions yet. There would be time. And if not, then silence would have to be enough. It was the oldest girl, maybe 12, who finally pointed through the trees. There, she said. That's the house. It wasn't much. A slanted cabin, smoke barely curling from the chimney. A barn that leaned like an old man tired of standing. But it was dry, and it was something. Inside the warmth of the stove was the first kind thing Eleanor had felt since stepping off the train. The children peeled off their coats and boots with practiced weariness, each moving with the heavy rhythm of those who knew how to survive. There were no adults, no note, no message. Eleanor set her bag on the floor and turned slowly. "Where is Mr. Merritt?" she asked softly. The youngest girl, eyes too old for her years, looked up. "Pa went out before the snow. He ain't come back." Eleanor sat down hard. No husband, no promise kept, no explanation. Just 7 children and a snowstorm and a house full of quiet hunger. She could leave, she thought. No one would blame her. The train would run again in 3 days, weather permitting. But then the little one with the curls brought her a worn pair of socks, held them up like a peace offering, and whispered, "Mama used to sew these. Maybe you could too." Something broke softly inside Eleanor, not like glass shattering, more like an old cupboard door finally swinging open after years sealed shut. She reached for the socks. "I'll do my best," she said. Not because she had to, not because she was ready, but because someone somewhere had once written, "Please don't let her leave." When the storm deepens and no man returns, Eleanor must choose wait for the promise that abandoned her or become the shelter she never had. By the third night, Eleanor was sewing by lantern light, her fingers stiff from cold and threadbare gloves. The children slept curled beside one another, like puppies, always touching, always quiet. They hadn't asked again about their father, but Eleanor had. She found the courage on the second day to pry open the drawer beside the bed. It was full of small things, buttons, a cracked compass, a Bible with a torn cover, and underneath it all, a letter. The envelope was never sealed. The handwriting was rough but clear. To Miss Eleanor Price. "If you arrive and I'm not there, please don't leave. My children, they don't need a wife. They need a home. I never wanted to trick you. I only hoped you might choose to stay. William Merritt." She held the letter for a long time. Then she read it again. She should have been angry at the audacity, the deceit, the cruel gamble of it all. But what she felt was heavier and quieter. She had known what it meant to be unwanted, to be passed over for not smiling enough, for not being soft or pretty or easy. And this man, he hadn't wanted a smile. He had wanted someone who stayed. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept listening for a knock on the door, a crunch of boots in the snow. Nothing came, but she did not pack. She mended the baby's coat, poured water for the stove, and waited. And in her waiting, something else came to life, a flicker of choice. Not duty, not pity. She wanted to stay. But the mind has its battles even after the heart surrenders. Every creak of the wind was a question. What if he never returns? What if you're only filling someone else's absence? What if this becomes your new version of abandonment? And still every morning she rose with the children and taught them how to shape a day out of sorrow. When a stranger stumbles through the blizzard with news she never expected, Eleanor must decide, will she protect what's growing in her heart, or prepare to lose it all? The blizzard had turned to soft flurries by morning. It was the kind of snow that whispered instead of roared, blanketing the homestead in quiet. Eleanor stepped outside just as the wind shifted, her shawl pulled tight around her. That's when she saw him. Not William, not yet, but someone. A stranger on horseback, slumped forward in the saddle, a scarf crusted in ice wrapped tight around his face. The horse was spent, steam curling from its flanks. Eleanor's heart seized not from fear, but from something worse, the ache of maybe. She ran to the barn, helped him down. It wasn't William. It was a young man, barely 30, wrapped in a cavalry coat too big for his shoulders. Blood stained one sleeve. Inside by the stove, his voice cracked. You, Eleanor Price. She nodded, kneeling beside him. I was riding with William Merritt. He told me about you. We, we got separated. That avalanche, it took part of the trail. He said if anything happened, I was to find you. He said, tell her not to leave. Tell her I'm coming back. Eleanor didn't cry. Not right then. She made him tea. She cleaned his wound. She listened. The young man Jacob had grown up with William. They had joined the same supply run, trading and gathering medicine for the valley towns. William hadn't meant to be gone long, just a few days, but the weather turned, and he had insisted they split, sending Jacob ahead with one thing in mind: make sure Eleanor and the children were safe. He said you were the strongest woman he'd never met, Jacob murmured before falling asleep by the fire. That night, Eleanor sat beside the coals, holding her breath against the hope blooming quietly inside her. She wasn't waiting anymore because she was lost. She was waiting because she was loved. When Eleanor dares to rebuild not just a house, but a life, a letter from William's past threatens to undo it all. Will she stand firm or retreat into silence once more? The snow melted slowly, and with it came the thaw in Eleanor's chest. Jacob stayed until he could ride again, mending fences and fixing doors, becoming another thread in the odd tapestry of Eleanor's new life. The children took to him like stray cats, to warmth cautiously, then all at once. Each evening Eleanor read aloud by the fire, and each night she walked to the barn hoping William would come riding through the trees. Then one day a letter came. It arrived in the coat pocket of a trader who'd passed through Shelter Ridge, addressed in a rough scrawl. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she opened it, but the letter wasn't from William. It was from Sarah Merritt, his late wife. It had been written just days before her death. In it, Sarah begged Eleanor, though she didn't know her name, not to marry William. He's a good man, but he's still broken. It read, you deserve someone who sees you, not just someone who needs you. Eleanor read the lines over and over. It was a wound she hadn't expected, not because Sarah was wrong, but because maybe she was right. That night she didn't light the fire. She didn't read. She sat in the dark, staring at the note, the weight of Sarah's pain mingling with her own. Was William truly ready for her? Or had he simply reached out in desperation, clutching for someone to replace the silence left behind? For a woman who had been judged for her silence? That question cut deepest of all. The next morning, Eleanor packed her things quietly. She didn't leave, but she moved her things back into the guest room. And for the first time since she arrived, she didn't smile when the children asked if William would come back, because she didn't know anymore. Not what he wanted, not what she did. As the spring winds carry footsteps up the trail, Eleanor must decide, will she face the man returning, or the truth within her own heart? Spring arrived with its usual Western flair, loud, messy, full of life, trying its best to grow out of cracked earth. Eleanor wasn't the same woman who arrived in Shelter Ridge months before. She knew how to stack wood now, how to teach a 7-year-old to sew a patch straight, and most importantly, how to draw a line not in anger, but in quiet grace. She no longer looked toward the road for William. Not every morning. Instead, she turned her energy toward building something steady, not just out of lumber and tools, but out of warmth. For the children, for herself. And then one Sunday morning, she heard the horse. Not many people rode up the trail that early. She stepped out onto the porch, and there he was, William, weathered, weary, and alone. He dismounted slowly, holding his hat in both hands like he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. I'm sorry, he said. The words weren't dramatic. They were barely more than a whisper, but they held weight. He handed her another letter, unopened this time. One he'd written but hadn't had the courage to send. In it, he didn't talk about her smile. He talked about his cowardice, about hiding behind grief, about not believing he deserved joy, and how seeing her not smile, just sit with her pain without needing to fix it, was the first honest thing he'd witnessed in years. I didn't come here to ask you back, he said, voice catching. I came because I never gave you the choice to walk away from me, and you deserve that. Eleanor stood still. Then slowly she reached into her apron pocket and handed him Sarah's letter. He read it, eyes narrowing, then softening. I knew she'd written it, he said, but I never opened it. Couldn't face it. They stood in silence. Then she said softly, I'm not here to fix you, William. and I don't want to be chosen out of guilt. He met her eyes. What if I choose you out of respect? As the past loosens its grip, Eleanor must decide whether love born from honesty can bloom where pain once took root. The wind had calmed. The sun spilled over the hills like warm tea across a wooden table, slow, comforting, familiar. Eleanor stood on the back porch of the modest home she had helped restore. Children's laughter floated through the air, tangled with the scent of stew and old lilac. And inside, William was reading aloud this time, not just to the kids, but to her too. He didn't raise his voice to perform. He didn't soften it to impress. He read like someone who knew silence was sacred, and that words were best shared with those who'd earned them. She hadn't said yes that morning he returned. In fact, she hadn't said much at all. But she stayed, and that was answer enough. Not because she pitied him, not because he apologized, but because he showed up again and again without needing her to smile or change or shrink. He built her a rocking chair, not out of penance but with hands steady from purpose. He planted lilacs beside her kitchen window because she once said, "They remind me of Mama." He showed love not in promises, but in the way he held space for her grief, as if it too were worthy of being loved. And over time, when no one asked for it, Eleanor smiled. Not the kind of smile people demanded from her in exchange for affection, but the quiet, crinkled, mid-morning kind. Born from a peace she never thought she'd find. Sometimes the heart doesn't need fireworks to know it's home. Eleanor had once been dismissed for not smiling, for not laughing loudly, for not fitting the image someone else expected. But in the end, she didn't need someone who wanted a perfect picture. She needed someone who saw her quiet, steady kind, and smiled first without asking for anything in return. And that's what she found. Not a man chasing youth or charm, but one who had known grief and knew the quiet miracle of someone who stays. Together they built a life not made of grand declarations, but of small, sacred moments, warm coffee on cold mornings, silent walks at dusk, and shared glances that said, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." If you've ever felt overlooked or told you were too much or not enough, this story is your reminder real love doesn't ask you to become someone else. It waits for you to simply be. And if this story touched your heart, we'd love for you to stay a little longer. Subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where stories like this ride gentle through the wind. Share this with someone who might need a little hope today. And tell us in the comments, would you like to hear more stories like this one? Or maybe the next chapter of Eleanor's journey? Until then, keep writing kind.